They are one of the smallest ethnic groups on Earth, somewhere between 10 and 14 million people, scattered across dozens of countries, making up less than 0.2% of the global population. By any measure of pure numbers, they should be a footnote in history. Instead, their fingerprints are on much of the modern world as we know it. Albert Einstein reshaped our understanding of the universe. Sigmund Freud changed how we think about the human mind. Steven Spielberg defined what American cinema could be. And today, figures like Mark Zuckerberg and others with Ashkenazi roots sit at the center of science, technology, culture, and public life in ways that have prompted serious scientific questions. Not questions rooted in prejudice, questions rooted in genuine curiosity. Because when researchers began mapping the genetics of Ashkenazi Jews in the 21st century, what they found did not match what anyone expected. The story that emerged from those laboratories is one of the most surprising and genuinely strange in the history of human genetics. And it begins not in a laboratory, but on the roads of medieval Europe, with a people who were never supposed to survive at all. The word Ashkenaz appears first in ancient Jewish texts, linked to the biblical figure who was a grandson of Noah. But in real history, it came to describe something far more specific: Jewish communities that settled in the Rhine Valley of Germany during the early Middle Ages, then spread east into Poland, Lithuania, and the vast territories of Eastern Europe. By the 14th century, Ashkenazi Jews made up the majority of Europe's Jewish population. They developed their own language, Yiddish, a remarkable hybrid built on a foundation of medieval German dialects, but woven through with Hebrew, Slavic, and Romance elements. A language born at the crossroads of civilizations. Their religious practices, traditions, and community structures differed significantly from those of Sephardic Jews in the Mediterranean world. Ashkenazi identity was not simply a branch of a larger tree. It was something new, shaped by centuries of living as a minority inside Christian Europe, maintaining a distinct culture while absorbing, generation by generation, elements of the world around them. What nobody knew at the time was that this process of formation was leaving a very specific signature, one that scientists would not be able to read until the age of modern genetics. When large-scale genetic studies of Ashkenazi Jews began in the early 2000s, the results surprised almost everyone in the field. The assumption going in was straightforward. Ashkenazi Jews traced their origins to the ancient Levant, the historical homeland of the Jewish people in the Middle East. Their genome should reflect that. A strong Middle Eastern signature, distinct from the European populations they had lived among for centuries. What the data showed was something far more complicated. The Y chromosome, passed from father to son, told one story. Only about 10 to 15% of Ashkenazi men carry haplogroup J, the genetic marker most strongly associated with ancient Semitic populations of the Middle East. The majority carry markers far more common among Eastern Europeans, including haplogroup R1A, the same marker predominant among Russians, Poles, and Ukrainians. Also present were markers associated with the Caucasus region, North Africa, and the Eurasian steppe. The mitochondrial DNA, passed through the maternal line, told an even more striking story. The overwhelming majority of Ashkenazi women descend from just 4 mitochondrial lineages, and all 4 of those lineages are of European origin, traced to women who lived in northern Italy and Central Europe roughly 2,000 years ago. The picture that emerged was unexpected. On the paternal side, a complex mosaic of Middle Eastern, Slavic, Caucasian, and steppe ancestry. On the maternal side, almost entirely European. This was not the genetic profile of a people who had remained isolated from their surrounding populations. This was the profile of a community that had formed through centuries of encounter, intermarriage, and absorption, while maintaining its religious and cultural identity across all of it. The science was clear. The interpretation was anything but. One of the most debated questions in Ashkenazi history involves a state that most people have never heard of. The Khazar Khaganate was a powerful empire that stretched across the steppes of Eastern Europe from roughly the 7th to the 10th century. Its ruling elite, according to multiple historical sources, including Arab chroniclers and Jewish texts of the period, converted to Judaism sometime in the 8th or 9th century. This conversion is one of the more unusual events in medieval history, a Turkic steppe empire adopting the religion of a small dispersed people as its official faith. When the Khazar state collapsed in the 10th century, its population scattered westward into Eastern Europe, into precisely the territories where Ashkenazi Jewish communities would later become concentrated. Some historians and geneticists have proposed that a significant portion of Eastern European Jews are not primarily descended from the ancient Jerusalem diaspora, but from Khazar converts who adopted Judaism and gradually merged with existing Jewish communities. The genetic evidence for this is partial and contested. The presence of steppe-related markers in Ashkenazi DNA is consistent with Khazar ancestry, but does not prove it. Most geneticists today favor a model of mixed origins rather than a single dominant source. What is not contested is this: the Ashkenazi genetic profile cannot be explained by descent from a single ancient population. It is the result of multiple waves of migration, intermarriage, and community formation across a vast geographic area over more than 1,000 years. A mosaic, not a straight line. Alongside the unexpected ancestry markers, researchers found something else in Ashkenazi genetics that has occupied scientists for decades. A cluster of rare hereditary conditions, Tay-Sachs disease, Gaucher's disease, Bloom syndrome, Canavan disease, and certain mutations in the genes associated with hereditary breast and ovarian cancer, occur in Ashkenazi populations at rates dramatically higher than in the general population. Some of these conditions are 10 to 100 times more common among Ashkenazi Jews than among non-Jewish populations of European descent. The explanation lies in what geneticists call the founder effect, or bottleneck effect. At some point in medieval history, most likely during the devastating persecutions and expulsions of the 12th through 14th centuries, the Ashkenazi population was reduced to a very small number of individuals, perhaps a few hundred families, perhaps fewer. All of the hundreds of millions of Ashkenazi descendants alive today trace back to that small founding population. The genetic variants those founders carried, including the disease-associated mutations, were passed forward through every subsequent generation, becoming far more common in this population than they would be in a larger, more genetically diverse group. The same bottleneck that created vulnerability also created something researchers did not expect to find: a degree of genetic cohesion that has allowed scientists to trace Ashkenazi ancestry, migration patterns, and family connections with a precision rarely possible in any other population. The genetic record of this community, written in the DNA of people alive today, is one of the most detailed in human science. Perhaps no question about Ashkenazi Jews has generated more discussion or more controversy than the question of intellectual achievement. Ashkenazi Jews received Nobel Prizes at a rate that, when adjusted for population size, is remarkable by any calculation. In fields ranging from physics and chemistry to economics and literature, the representation of Ashkenazi-descended individuals among major scientific and cultural figures of the 20th century drew serious academic attention. Two broad explanations have been proposed, and most researchers believe both play a role. The first is cultural. For centuries, Ashkenazi communities placed extraordinary value on literacy and scholarship. Boys began studying religious texts at very young ages. The ability to read, analyze, debate, and interpret complex arguments was not just admired, It was the central measure of a person's worth in community life. This created an environment, sustained across dozens of generations, in which intellectual work was the highest form of human activity. When those communities encountered the modern world and its secular institutions, those habits of mind translated directly into academic and professional achievement. The second is genetic, and it is more contested. Some researchers have proposed that centuries of selecting community leaders and religious scholars, men whose status and resources allowed them to have more children, may have created selection pressure favoring cognitive traits. The genetic evidence for this is suggestive but not conclusive. What can be said is that certain genetic variants found at elevated rates in Ashkenazi populations are also associated with neural development. Whether the cause is cultural, genetic, or, as most researchers suspect, a reinforcing combination of both, the pattern is real. And the figures who embody it span an extraordinary range. Einstein and Freud changed entire fields of human knowledge. In our own time, people with Ashkenazi roots have shaped technology, film, medicine, and public policy in ways that will be debated and studied for generations. How much of this traces to culture, how much to genetics, and how much simply to the particular historical circumstances that placed this community at the center of 20th century intellectual life? That question remains genuinely open. The history of Ashkenazi Jews in Europe is also a history of what was done to them. Blamed for the Black Death of the 14th century, Jewish communities across Germany and France were massacred. Expelled from England, then France, then Spain, then dozens of individual cities and territories across Central Europe over the following centuries. Confined to ghettos. Subjected to waves of organized violence, the pogroms of the Russian Empire in the 19th and early 20th centuries that killed tens of thousands and drove millions to emigrate. And then the Holocaust. Between 1941 and 1945, approximately 6 million Jews were systematically murdered across occupied Europe. The overwhelming majority were Ashkenazi. Entire communities, towns, and cities where Yiddish had been spoken for 500 years were erased in a matter of months. The fact that Ashkenazi culture, language, and identity survived this at all is, by any measure, extraordinary. The Yiddish language nearly died with its speakers. The religious and scholarly traditions that had been passed down through generations came within a generation of extinction. What survived did so because of individuals who carried it out of Europe, to America, to Israel, to wherever they could reach. The Ashkenazi story is not only a story of achievement, it is a story of survival under conditions designed specifically to prevent it. Today, Ashkenazi Jews are part of a broader Israeli society that contains Jewish communities from across the world, from Yemen, Ethiopia, Morocco, Iraq, Iran, and dozens of other countries. Each community carries its own genetic profile, its own traditions, its own relationship to Jewish history. Within Israel, these differences are sometimes a source of tension. The Ashkenazi communities that arrived from Europe in the 20th century played a dominant role in founding the state and shaping its early institutions. That legacy is still felt in politics, in culture, in social structures, and it is still debated. Outside Israel, Ashkenazi descendants are woven into the fabric of American and European life in ways that would have been unimaginable to the people who fled the pogroms of Eastern Europe a century ago. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren of refugees who arrived at Ellis Island with nothing became scientists, filmmakers, politicians, and entrepreneurs. Mark Zuckerberg built a platform used by billions of people. Others shaped law, medicine, finance, and the arts. Whether you see this as a story about genetics, about culture, about the particular pressures that persecution can create, or simply about what human beings are capable of when given the chance to flourish, It is a story that resists simple explanation, which may be exactly why it keeps demanding to be told. The people who carried this story forward did not do so because they were certain of survival. They did so because the alternative was silence, and silence, for a community that had placed a book at the center of its identity for 3,000 years, was never an option.